The old train yard lay sprawled on the outskirts of town, a desolate relic of a bygone era. Rusted tracks crisscrossed the grounds, leading to abandoned trains and decaying rail cars, their paint peeling and windows shattered. A heavy mist hung perpetually over the area, shrouding it in an almost supernatural gloom. For decades, locals had whispered about the tragic accident that had claimed dozens of lives and left the train yard haunted by restless spirits. Killian Matthews had heard the stories, but he was a practical man. A job was a job, and he needed this one. As the new foreman, he was responsible for overseeing the crew tasked with revitalizing the yard, transforming it into a historical attraction. On his first day, he stood at the entrance, taking in the eerie silence that enveloped the place. "Welcome to your new home away from home," said Carl, the yard's grizzled old caretaker, with a wry smile. "Heard the stories yet?" Killian nodded, glancing at the fog-shrouded tracks. "Yeah, I've heard them. Ghosts, accidents, all that stuff." Carl chuckled. "Well, you'll see for yourself soon enough. Just keep an eye out. Things aren't always what they seem around here." As the crew gathered, Killian gave them their assignments. The mist thickened, and the air grew colder. Sarah, a young and enthusiastic worker, shivered and wrapped her arms around herself. "Is it always this cold?" she asked, her breath visible in the frigid air. "Pretty much," Carl replied. "Especially when the fog rolls in. They say it's the spirits of the dead, trying to find their way back." The workers exchanged uneasy glances, but set to their tasks. Killian took charge of inspecting the rail cars, starting with one of the oldest. The train, a massive iron beast, sat motionless on the tracks, its interior cloaked in darkness. He climbed aboard, the wood creaking ominously under his weight. Inside, the air was stale, carrying the scent of decay and old metal. Killian switched on his flashlight, the beam cutting through the gloom. The seats were torn, and graffiti covered the walls. As he moved deeper into the car, a sudden chill ran down his spine. He turned sharply, feeling as though someone was watching him. "Hello?" he called out, his voice echoing back to him. There was no answer, only the sound of the wind whistling through the broken windows. Shaking off his unease, Killian continued his inspection. But the feeling of being watched persisted, growing stronger with each step. Shadows seemed to flicker at the edge of his vision, disappearing whenever he tried to focus on them. Outside, the mist grew denser, swallowing the train yard in an impenetrable gray. The workers' figures became ghostly silhouettes, their movements sluggish and distorted. Sarah, working near the tracks, felt a prickling sensation on the back of her neck. She glanced around, but the mist obscured everything. "Killian," she called out, her voice barely a whisper in the heavy fog. "Anyone there?" The only response was the distant clanging of metal, like a spectral echo of the yard's past. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the mist, moving toward her. Sarah's heart pounded as the shape grew clearer, revealing a man in an old-fashioned conductor's uniform. His eyes were empty sockets, and his face was a ghastly white. Paralyzed with fear, Sarah watched as the apparition raised a bony hand, pointing directly at her. She stumbled backward, tripping over the rails and falling hard onto the gravel. The figure vanished as quickly as it had appeared, leaving Sarah gasping for breath. Killian found her moments later, pale and trembling. "Sarah, what happened?" I saw something," she stammered, pointing to where the figure had stood. A man. He wasn't human. Killian helped her to her feet, his expression serious. Let's get you inside. We need to talk to Carl. As they made their way to the old maintenance shed that served as their base, the fog seemed to part before them, as if retreating from some unseen force. Inside, Carl listened intently as Sarah described her encounter. His face grew grim. You've seen the Phantom Conductor, he said quietly. He's one of the spirits tied to the accident. Looks like the stories are true, after all. Killian felt a chill settle in his bones, the weight of the yard's history pressing down on him. The shadows in the mist were more than just tricks of the light. They were harbingers of the terror that lay ahead. As the day slipped into night, the old train yard took on an even more ominous appearance. The fog thickened, and the chill in the air became almost unbearable. Inside the maintenance shed, the workers gathered, their faces pale and tense. Killian and Carl exchanged worried glances, knowing they had to keep the crew calm despite the growing unease. All right, everyone, Killian began, trying to sound authoritative. We had a bit of a scare earlier, but let's not lose our heads. We've got a job to do, and we'll get through. Sarah sat in the corner, still shaken from her encounter with the Phantom Conductor. She couldn't shake the image of his hollow eyes and skeletal hand pointing at her. The others listened, but there was a palpable tension in the air. As the night shift began, the workers spread out across the yard, their flashlights casting eerie beams of light through the fog. Killian took the lead, checking in on each group to ensure they were safe and focused on their tasks. But the oppressive atmosphere made it hard to concentrate. It wasn't long before the whispers began. At first they were faint, barely perceptible over the sound of the wind. But as the night wore on, they grew louder, more insistent. Killian was inspecting an old engine when he heard it. A soft, urgent murmuring, like someone speaking just out of earshot. "Hello?" he called out, his voice echoing in the empty yard. "Is someone there?" There was no response, only the rustling of leaves and the distant clatter of metal. Killian shook his head, trying to dismiss it as his imagination. But the whispers followed him, growing clearer with each step. He could almost make out words now, fragmented and overlapping. Help. Lost. Tragedy. Killian's heart pounded in his chest. He quickened his pace, eager to rejoin the others. But the whispers seemed to follow him, trailing him like a shadow. He rounded a corner and nearly collided with Carl, who looked equally disturbed. "Did you hear that?" Killian asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Carl nodded, his eyes wide. "It's them, the souls from the accident. They're trying to communicate." Before Killian could respond, a piercing scream echoed through the yard. They sprinted toward the sound, their flashlights bobbing wildly. They found Tim, another worker, standing frozen with terror near an old caboose. "Tim, what happened?" Carl demanded, grabbing the man's shoulders. Tim's eyes were wide with fear. "I heard them. Voices. They were all around me. And then I saw her." "Saw who?" Killian asked, his skin prickling with unease. "The woman. She was standing on the tracks. She looked right at me and then she vanished." Killian exchanged a grim look with Carl. The stories were true. The spirits were real, and they were making their presence known. "We need to get everyone inside," Carl said firmly. "It's not safe out here." They gathered the crew and hurried back to the maintenance shed. Once inside, Killian locked the door, his mind racing. The whispers had followed them, growing louder, more desperate. The workers huddled together, their fear palpable. "We can't keep working like this," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "We need to find out what they want." Killian nodded. "Carl, do you know anything more about the accident? Anything that might help us understand why they're haunting this place?" Carl sighed, running a hand through his thinning hair. "The accident happened nearly 50 years ago. A runaway train collided with another on the tracks, killing dozens. They say the conductor tried to stop it, but the brakes failed. The souls of those who died that night, they've never found peace. Maybe they're trying to tell us something," Sarah suggested. "Something we need to do to help them." Killian considered this. "We need more information. Tomorrow, we'll go through the old records and see what we can find. Maybe there's something we missed." As the night wore on, the whispers grew louder, filling the shed with their eerie murmur. The workers tried to sleep, but the relentless voices kept them awake, fraying their nerves. Killian sat by the window, staring out into the fog-shrouded yard, his mind racing with thoughts of the restless spirits and the mystery that lay ahead. In the darkness, the ghostly whispers continued, a chilling reminder that the past was not so easily forgotten. The next morning, the train yard was bathed in a weak, gray light. The fog had lifted slightly, revealing the rusty, dilapidated landscape in stark relief. The workers, bleary-eyed and jittery from a night of restless whispers, gathered in the maintenance shed. Killian stood at the head of the group, his determination barely masking his own unease. "All right, everyone," Killian began, holding up a stack of old records and newspaper clippings. "We're going to dig into the past. There has to be something in here that can help us understand what's happening." They spread out the documents on the large table, each taking a section to examine. Sarah, still pale but resolute, took the pile of newspaper articles. As she read through them, the tragic story of the accident began to unfold. "Listen to this," she said, her voice cutting through the quiet. "The accident happened on a foggy night just like this. The conductor, a man named Thomas Gray, was blamed for the crash. They said he fell asleep at the controls." Carl shook his head. "That's not what I've heard. The old-timers used to say Gray was a hero, that he tried to stop the train but the brakes failed." Killian frowned. "So there's conflicting stories. Maybe Gray wasn't at fault. Maybe that's why he's still here, trying to clear his name." As they continued their search, the air in the shed grew colder. Killian glanced up, his eyes narrowing as he saw his breath misting in the frigid air. The temperature drop was sudden, unnatural. "Did you feel that?" Sarah whispered, looking around nervously. Before anyone could respond, the door to the shed creaked open, and a blast of icy air swept through the room. The workers froze as a figure materialized in the doorway, slowly taking shape. It was the conductor, Thomas Gray, his ghostly form translucent and flickering. His eyes were empty sockets, and his face was a mask of sorrow. He moved forward, gliding silently across the floor. The workers backed away, but Killian stood his ground, his heart pounding. "Thomas Gray," Killian said, his voice steady. "We know about the accident. We want to help you." The ghost's eyes seemed to focus on Killian, a flicker of recognition passing through them. He raised his hand, pointing toward the stack of documents on the table. The papers rustled as if stirred by an unseen breeze, and a single newspaper clipping fluttered to the ground. Sarah picked it up, her hands trembling. It's an article from a week after the accident, she said. It says that Gray was found dead in the wreckage. But there's more. It mentions an investigation into faulty brake lines. Killian's eyes widened. Faulty brake lines. That means the accident wasn't his fault. He was trying to stop it, just like Carl said. The ghost of Thomas Gray nodded slowly, his form growing fainter. The air in the shed grew warmer, and the oppressive feeling began to lift. But before he could disappear entirely, the whispers started again, louder and more desperate than before. "We still need to know more," Killian said, his mind racing. "Why are the other spirits still here?" Gray's ghost pointed to the train yard, then slowly dissipated, leaving behind a lingering chill. Killian turned to the others, his expression resolute. "We're getting closer," he said. "We need to find out what happened to the passengers. There has to be something we're missing." As they left the shed, the fog began to thicken once more, and the air grew cold again. The workers moved cautiously, their nerves frayed by the previous night's events. Killian led the way to the site of the collision, hoping to find more clues. Near the rusted remains of the old tracks, they found a makeshift memorial, wilted flowers, faded photographs, and a plaque with the names of the victims. The sight was haunting, a stark reminder of the lives lost. Sarah knelt by the plaque, tracing the names with her fingers. "They were all so young," she murmured. "We have to help them find peace." As they stood in silent reflection, a gust of wind swept through the yard, carrying with it the faint sound of voices. Killian strained to listen, trying to make out the words. "Forgive. Remember. Release." Killian turned to the group, determination in his eyes. "We need to hold a proper memorial for them, something to honor their memory and help them move on." The workers nodded in agreement, their fear replaced by a sense of purpose. Together, they began to plan a ceremony, hoping it would be enough to lay the spirits to rest. But as they worked, the fog thickened once more, and the oppressive feeling returned. The phantom conductor might have found some peace, but the train yard's ghosts were far from done. The workers spent the next day preparing for the memorial, gathering flowers, candles, and anything else they could find to honor the victims of the tragic accident. Killian coordinated with the local historical society, hoping to invite the townspeople and anyone connected to the incident. The sense of purpose helped lift their spirits, but the eerie atmosphere of the train yard remained. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the fog rolled in, the workers gathered near the old tracks where the makeshift memorial stood. The air was thick with anticipation and a palpable tension. Killian stood at the front, holding a list of names. "We're here tonight to honor the souls lost in the tragic accident that took place here 50 years ago," Killian began, his voice carrying through the still air. "We believe that acknowledging their memories will help them find the peace they deserve." Sarah stepped forward, lighting a row of candles along the tracks. The flickering flames cast long shadows, creating an eerie, otherworldly glow. As the last candle was lit, a hush fell over the group. Killian began to read the names, each one a poignant reminder of the lives cut short. Emily Carter, age 24. John Thompson, age 32. Margaret Lewis, age 19. With each name, the fog seemed to swirl and shift, as if responding to the call. The workers exchanged uneasy glances, feeling the presence of the spirits growing stronger. As Killian read the final name, A sudden gust of wind extinguished the candles, plunging the yard into darkness. A cold chill settled over the group, and the whispers began again, louder and more distinct than ever before. The workers huddled together, their eyes wide with fear. Killian felt a presence behind him and turned slowly, half expecting to see the phantom conductor once more. Instead, a multitude of ghostly figures emerged from the fog, their forms shimmering and translucent. Men, women, and children, all victims of the accident, stood before them, their expressions a mixture of sorrow and longing. Among them was Thomas Gray, the phantom conductor, his spectral hand outstretched in a gesture of gratitude. "We hear you," Killian said, his voice steady despite the fear gnawing at him. "We know you've been trying to communicate. We want to help you find peace." One of the spirits, a young woman with a broken expression, stepped forward. Her mouth moved, but no sound came out. Killian strained to understand, but it was Sarah who finally deciphered the ghost's silent plea. "Forgive us. Remember us. Release us," Sarah repeated softly, tears welling in her eyes. Carl, standing at the back, suddenly remembered an old tradition from the town's past. "We need to release lanterns," he said. In the old days, they believed that lanterns guided lost souls to the afterlife. The workers hurried to find lanterns, and within minutes, they had a dozen ready. They lit them carefully, the soft glow illuminating the ghostly figures. As the lanterns began to rise into the sky, the spirits watched with a mixture of hope and sadness. "Go in peace," Killian whispered, his eyes fixed on the ascending lights. The ghosts began to fade, their forms growing more insubstantial with each passing second. The air grew warmer, and the oppressive feeling started to lift. But as the last lantern disappeared into the night sky, a final whisper echoed through the yard, chilling Killian to the bone. "Not all are free. The truth remains hidden." Killian felt a sinking feeling in his chest. The ceremony had helped, but it wasn't enough. There were still secrets buried in the train yard, secrets that kept some souls tethered to this world. "We're not done yet," Killian said, turning to his team. "There's more to uncover. We need to find out what really happened that night." The workers nodded, their fear replaced by a renewed determination. They knew the path ahead would be difficult, but they were resolved to uncover the truth and finally lay all the lost souls to rest. As the night deepened, they returned to the maintenance shed, their minds racing with questions and possibilities. The fog began to thin, and for the first time in days, the train yard seemed almost peaceful. But they knew it was only a temporary reprieve. The true mystery of the haunted train yard was still waiting to be solved. The next night brought a thick, almost suffocating fog back to the train yard. The workers, their nerves already frayed from the previous night's encounters, prepared for another long shift. Despite their fears, they knew they had to press on and uncover the truth behind the haunting. As the clock struck midnight, the air grew colder, and an unnatural silence fell over the yard. Killian, armed with a flashlight and a newfound determination, led the group as they resumed their work. They split into smaller teams, each focusing on different areas of the yard in the hopes of finding more clues. Killian and Sarah headed toward the old engine house, where the trains had once been repaired. The building loomed in the fog, its windows dark and empty. As they entered, their flashlights cast long, wavering shadows across the walls. The air was thick with dust and the scent of rusting metal. "Let's start with the maintenance logs," Killian suggested, pointing to a row of filing cabinets. "Maybe there's something here that will give us more insight into what went wrong." They began sifting through the files, their movements careful and deliberate. The silence was broken only by the occasional creak of the building settling and the soft rustle of paper. But as the minutes ticked by, a new sound emerged, a faint, rhythmic tapping, like footsteps echoing through the corridors. "Did you hear that?" Sarah whispered, her eyes wide with fear. Killian nodded, his grip tightening on the flashlight. "Stay close." They moved cautiously toward the source of the sound, their footsteps barely audible on the worn wooden floor. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, leading them deeper into the heart of the engine house. As they rounded a corner, the light from Killian's flashlight fell on a figure standing at the far end of the hall. It was the phantom conductor, his ghostly form flickering like a candle in the wind. His hollow eyes seemed to bore into Killian's soul, and his skeletal hand pointed toward a door at the end of the hall. Killian swallowed hard, his heart pounding in his chest. "He wants us to go in there." Sarah's voice trembled. "Do we have a choice?" They approached the door, the tapping sound now deafening. Killian reached out with a trembling hand and turned the knob. The door creaked open, revealing a small, dimly lit room filled with old tools and machinery. At the center of the room was a large workbench covered in dust and cobwebs. As they stepped inside, the temperature dropped sharply and the tapping ceased. Killian shone his flashlight over the workbench, his eyes scanning for anything unusual. Suddenly, Sarah gasped, pointing to a section of the wall behind the bench. "Look at that." Killian followed her gaze and saw a set of old blueprints pinned to the wall. They were for the brake system of the very train involved in the accident. His heart raced as he studied them, noting several discrepancies and corrections made in red ink. "This is it," Killian said, his voice filled with excitement. "This proves the brakes were faulty. Thomas Gray was trying to stop the train, but the system failed him." Before they could celebrate their discovery, the room grew darker, the shadows deepening and closing in around them. The air was filled with a low, menacing growl, and the walls seemed to pulse with a sinister energy. Killian and Sarah backed toward the door, but it slammed shut, trapping them inside. The growling grew louder, more threatening, and Killian felt a cold hand grasp his shoulder. He spun around expecting to see the phantom conductor, but instead he was face to face with a different apparition. A man with half his face burned, his eyes filled with rage. "Why didn't you save us?" the ghost hissed, his voice dripping with anger and pain. Killian's mind raced, trying to find the right words. "We're trying to help. We know about the brakes. We're going to make sure everyone knows the truth." The ghost's grip tightened, his burned face inches from Killian's. "It's too late for the truth. We need justice." Suddenly, the growling stopped, and the ghost released Killian, disappearing into the shadows. The door swung open, and Killian and Sarah stumbled out, gasping for breath. They looked at each other, their faces pale with fear. "We need to get out of here," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "We need to tell the others what we found." They rushed back to the maintenance shed, their footsteps echoing through the foggy yard. Inside, they found the rest of the crew huddled together, their faces etched with fear and exhaustion. "We found the proof," Killian announced, holding up the blueprints. "The brakes were faulty, Thomas Gray wasn't to blame. The workers stared at the blueprints, their expressions a mix of relief and apprehension. But before they could discuss their next steps, the shed door burst open, and a blast of cold air swept through the room. The ghostly figures from the previous night reappeared, their faces filled with desperation and anger. "We need to hold another seance," Carl said, his voice steady despite the fear in his eyes. "We need to contact the spirits and find out what they want." The workers nodded in agreement, their resolve strengthened by the discovery. They gathered around a makeshift table, placing their hands on its surface. Carl began to chant softly, calling out to the spirits and asking for guidance. The air grew colder, and the lights flickered as the spirits began to respond. The phantom conductor appeared once more, his hollow eyes filled with sorrow. "We know the truth," Killian said, his voice firm. "Tell us what we need to do to help you find peace." The ghost of Thomas Gray raised his hand, pointing to the blueprints. His voice was barely a whisper, but it carried a message that sent chills down Killian's spine. "Justice must be served." As the seance continued, the spirits began to reveal more about the night of the accident. The workers listened intently, their hearts heavy with the weight of the past. They knew they had to act, to bring justice to the lost souls and finally lay them to rest. The night shift was far from over, and the terror was only beginning. The atmosphere in the maintenance shed was thick with tension and fear as Carl continued the seance. The workers huddled around the table, their hands trembling, eyes wide with anticipation and dread. The ghostly presence of Thomas Gray loomed above them, his hollow eyes fixed on the blueprints that proved his innocence. "We're here to listen," Killian said, his voice steady despite the chill in the air. "Tell us what happened and what we need to do." The room grew colder, and the candles flickered violently. The shadows seemed to stretch and twist, forming shapes that danced around the walls. Suddenly, the ghost of a young woman appeared beside Gray. Her face was twisted in sorrow, and her eyes glistened with unshed tears. "Emily," Carl whispered, recognizing her from the old photographs in the records. "Tell us what you need." Emily's ghost raised her hand, pointing to the blueprints. Her voice, barely a whisper, filled the room. "He tried to save us. The brakes failed. But there was more. Sabotage." A collective gasp echoed through the room. Killian leaned forward, his heart racing. Sabotage. Who would do such a thing? Emily's ghost began to fade, her form flickering like a dying flame. "Find the ledger. Hidden. The truth." The room grew darker, and the temperature plummeted. The ghosts of the other victims appeared, their faces etched with pain and anger. They moved closer, their whispers merging into a cacophony of desperation and rage. "Justice, truth, release us." Carl's chanting grew louder, his voice straining to maintain control over the seance. The table shook, and the candles sputtered. Killian could feel the weight of the spirits pressing down on them, demanding to be heard. "We'll find the ledger," Killian promised, his voice resolute. "We'll uncover the truth and make sure justice is served." The ghosts began to recede, their forms dissolving into the shadows. The room grew warmer, and the oppressive feelings started to lift. But as the last spirit disappeared, a final chilling whisper echoed through the shed. "Beware, the traitor among you." The workers exchanged fearful glances, the weight of the warning sinking in. They knew they had to be careful, that someone among them might be hiding the truth. "We need to find that ledger," Sarah said, her voice shaking. "And we need to watch our backs." Killian nodded, his mind racing. "We'll start with the old office. If there's a hidden ledger, it would be there." They gathered their equipment and set out for the office building, a crumbling structure at the edge of the yard. The fog seemed to thicken as they approached, and the air grew colder. The sense of foreboding was palpable, and Killian couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Inside the office, the air was stale and musty. Dust covered every surface, and cobwebs hung in the corners. Killian and Sarah began to search the room, pulling open drawers and rifling through papers. The others spread out, checking for hidden compartments or secret passages. After what felt like hours, Sarah called out from behind an old filing cabinet. "Killian, I think I found something." Killian hurried over and helped her move the heavy cabinet, revealing a hidden panel in the wall. With trembling hands, he pried it open, revealing a small, dusty ledger. "This must be it," he said, carefully opening the book. The pages were yellowed with age, and the ink was faded, but the entries were still legible. As they read through the ledger, a horrifying picture began to emerge. The entries detailed a series of maintenance failures and deliberate sabotage of the brake system. It was clear that someone had been tampering with the trains, leading to the deadly accident. "Whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing," Sarah said, her voice trembling with anger. "They caused the accident on purpose." Killian nodded, his jaw clenched. "We need to take this to the authorities. This ledger proves everything." As they turned to leave, a figure stepped out of the shadows, blocking their path. It was Carl, his face twisted with anger and fear. "You're not going anywhere," he said, his voice low and menacing. "That ledger stays here." Killian's heart sank as the realization hit him. You were part of this." Carl's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "I didn't mean for it to go this far. I just wanted to protect my family. They forced me to do it." Before Killian could react, Carl lunged at him, trying to grab the ledger. They struggled, the old man's strength surprising Killian. But years of hard labor had made Killian strong, and he managed to wrestle Carl to the ground. "Help me!" Killian shouted to Sarah, who quickly grabbed a length of rope and helped tie Carl up. As they secured Carl, the other workers appeared, their faces a mix of shock and betrayal. Killian held up the ledger, his voice filled with determination. "We have the proof we need," he said. "We're going to make sure the truth comes out and the spirits find the justice they deserve." Carl slumped to the ground, defeated. "I'm so sorry," he whispered, tears streaming down his face. Killian and Sarah led the way back to the shed, the ledger clutched tightly in Killian's hand. The fog seemed to lift as they walked, and a sense of calm settled over the yard. They knew their journey was far from over, but they were one step closer to uncovering the truth and finally laying the haunted souls to rest. With the ledger secured, the workers knew they had the evidence needed to expose the truth about the tragic accident. Killian and Sarah immediately contacted the authorities, who agreed to send investigators to the train yard the next day. However, as night fell, the atmosphere grew heavier, and the air crackled with a sense of impending danger. "We can't wait for the authorities," Killian said, his voice filled with urgency. "The spirits are restless. We need to give them the closure they deserve tonight." Sarah nodded. "But how?" The seance helped, but it wasn't enough. We need to recreate the conditions of the accident, don't we? Killian's eyes lit up with understanding. Yes, we need to set the scene so the spirits can see that we've uncovered the truth and that justice will be served. The workers gathered around as Killian explained the plan. They would use one of the old trains still on the tracks, simulate the conditions of that fateful night, and attempt to communicate with the spirits one last time. There was a mix of fear and determination in their faces, but they knew this was their best chance to help the lost souls find peace. They worked quickly, preparing the old engine and clearing the tracks. The fog thickened, and the temperature dropped as midnight approached. The yard was bathed in an eerie glow from the lanterns they had set up along the tracks. Killian took his place in the cab of the old engine, with Sarah and a few others by his side. The rest of the workers spread out along the tracks, ready to assist. As the clock struck midnight, they started the engine, and the train slowly began to move. The whistle blew, echoing through the fog, and the air grew heavy with anticipation. Killian gripped the controls, his heart pounding as they rolled forward. The night was eerily silent, save for the rhythmic clanking of the train's wheels on the tracks. "Remember," Killian said, his voice steady. "We're doing this to show them we understand. We're here to help." As the train picked up speed, the fog seemed to close in around them. Shadows flickered at the edge of their vision, and the cold intensified. Killian felt a presence behind him, and turned to see the ghostly figure of Thomas Gray standing in the cab, his hollow eyes fixed on the tracks ahead. "We know the truth," Killian said, meeting Gray's gaze. "We're here to set things right." Gray's ghostly hand pointed toward the control panel, and Killian noticed a lever labeled "Emergency Brake." He nodded, understanding what needed to be done. As they approached the site of the original crash, Killian pulled the lever, and the train screeched to a halt. The silence that followed was deafening. The fog swirled around them, and the temperature plummeted. The workers stood still, their breaths visible in the icy air. Killian and Sarah stepped out of the cab, facing the ghosts that began to materialize around them. Thomas Gray moved forward, his form flickering like a candle in the wind. The other spirits followed, their faces etched with pain and sorrow. Killian held up the ledger, showing it to Gray. "We found the truth," Killian said. "The brakes were sabotaged. You tried to save them, but you were betrayed. We're going to make sure justice is served." Gray's ghostly eyes seemed to soften, and a faint smile touched his lips. The other spirits began to whisper, their voices blending into a haunting chorus. Killian and Sarah stood their ground, the weight of the moment pressing down on them. "Forgive us," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "We didn't know, but now we do, and we won't let your deaths be in vain." The spirits began to fade, their forms dissolving into the mist. But before they disappeared completely, Gray raised his hand in a gesture of gratitude. The oppressive feeling lifted, and the air grew warmer. Killian and Sarah exchanged relieved glances, knowing they had taken a significant step toward helping the spirits find peace. The train yard felt different, lighter, as if a heavy burden had been lifted. As they returned to the maintenance shed, they found the other workers waiting, their faces filled with hope. Killian held up the ledger, his voice strong and clear. "We did it. We showed them we know the truth. Now it's up to us to make sure the world knows too." The next morning, the investigators arrived, and Killian presented the ledger and the evidence they had gathered. The authorities were shocked by the revelation of sabotage and promised a full investigation. As they left, Killian felt a sense of closure, knowing that the spirits of the train yard would finally find justice. That night, as the workers gathered one last time, they held a final memorial for the victims, lighting lanterns and sending them into the sky. The fog lifted, revealing a clear, starry night. The train yard, once a place of tragedy and sorrow, now felt at peace. Killian looked at the sky, watching the lanterns float upward. "Rest in peace," he whispered. "You won't be forgotten." As the last lantern disappeared into the night, the workers knew their journey was over. The haunted train yard had finally found its peace, and so had they. The workers' sense of relief was short-lived. As night fell once more, the fog returned, thicker and colder than ever before. The air grew heavy, and an eerie silence settled over the train yard. Killian felt a deep unease, as if something was still unfinished, some lingering force holding the spirits back. "We need to leave," Sarah said, her voice tense. "Something doesn't feel right." Killian nodded. "You're right. We need to get everyone out of here. We'll let the authorities handle the rest." They gathered the workers, who were already on edge from the thickening fog and growing cold. As they started toward the exit, the shadows seemed to move, swirling and closing in around them. A sense of dread filled the air, and the workers' unease turned to outright fear. "Stick together," Killian instructed, his voice firm. "We'll make it out if we stay calm and move quickly." As they made their way through the yard, the ghostly figures of the victims began to reappear, their faces twisted with anger and despair. The temperature plummeted, and a chilling wind swept through the group. The whispers grew louder, more desperate, echoing all around them. "Help! Trapped! Release us!" Killian pushed forward, leading the group with Sarah by his side. The path to the exit seemed endless, the fog disorienting and thick. The spectral figures closed in, their hands reaching out, trying to stop them. "We're trying to help," Killian shouted, his voice almost lost in the cacophony of whispers. "We've done everything we can." Suddenly, a loud crash echoed through the yard, and the ground shook beneath their feet. The workers stumbled, fear gripping them as they looked around, trying to find the source of the disturbance. Killian's heart pounded as he realized the ghostly apparitions weren't just trying to scare them, they were trying to keep them there. "We need to move faster," he urged. "The spirits aren't done with us yet." They broke into a run, the fog swirling violently around them. The ghostly figures pursued, their whispers turning into anguished cries. The old train yard seemed to come alive with the spirits' unrest, the very ground beneath them pulsating with malevolent energy. As they neared the exit, the ghost of Thomas Gray appeared before them, his eyes filled with sorrow and urgency. He pointed toward a derelict engine on a parallel track, its rusted bulk looming in the mist. "What's he trying to tell us?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. Killian looked at the engine, then back at Gray. "There's something we're missing, something about that engine." They hesitated only for a moment before deciding to investigate. The group moved toward the old engine, the ghost of Thomas Gray leading the way. As they approached, the air grew colder and the shadows deepened. Killian climbed into the cab, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. Inside, the engine was in disrepair, its controls rusted and broken. But as Killian shone his light over the walls, he noticed something strange, a series of markings, almost like scratches, running along the metal. They formed a pattern, a message carved in desperation. "Sarah, look at this," Killian said, his voice hushed. Sarah climbed up beside him, her eyes widening as she saw the markings. "It's a message. Someone was trying to tell us something." They traced the markings, slowly deciphering the words. Sabotage, betrayed, trapped, free us. Killian's heart sank as he realized the full extent of the tragedy. The spirits are trapped here because of the betrayal. They can't leave until the truth is fully acknowledged and the guilty are held accountable. A loud crash interrupted their thoughts, and the ground shook violently. The workers outside screamed in terror as the ghostly figures grew more aggressive, their forms becoming more solid and menacing. "We have to get out now," Killian shouted, grabbing Sarah's hand. They jumped down from the engine and rejoined the group, pushing toward the exit with renewed urgency. The spirits' cries grew louder, their hands reaching out, trying to pull them back. The fog swirled violently, the temperature dropping even further. As they neared the gate, a final deafening crash echoed through the yard. The ground split open behind them, a chasm of darkness and cold. The spirits' cries turned into wails of despair, but Thomas Gray's ghost stood at the edge, holding the others back. "Go!" Gray's voice boomed, clear and strong. "You must live to tell the truth." Killian and the others burst through the gate, the oppressive fog lifting as they crossed the threshold. The air grew warmer, and the night sky cleared, revealing a canopy of stars. They collapsed on the ground, gasping for breath, their hearts pounding with relief and exhaustion. The train yard lay silent behind them, the spirits' cries fading into the distance. Killian looked back, his heart heavy with the weight of their escape and the knowledge of what they had uncovered. "We did it," Sarah whispered, her voice filled with awe and relief. "We made it out." Killian nodded, his eyes fixed on the dark silhouette of the train yard. "But we still have work to do. We need to make sure the world knows the truth, so those spirits can finally find peace." As they stood together, the first light of dawn began to break on the horizon, casting a hopeful glow over the train yard. The haunted past had been uncovered, but the journey for justice was just beginning. The dawn broke with a sense of eerie calm over the old train yard, a stark contrast to the turmoil of the previous night. Killian, Sarah, and the other workers gathered their belongings and prepared to leave the site for good. The experiences they had endured had left them shaken, but also resolute in their mission to bring justice to the lost souls and reveal the truth to the world. As they waited for the authorities to arrive, Killian and Sarah sat on a bench near the entrance, their minds replaying the haunting events. The fog had lifted, revealing the yard in the soft light of morning. It seemed almost peaceful now, but they knew better. "We did everything we could," Sarah said softly, her eyes reflecting the exhaustion and relief of the past few days. Killian nodded. "Yes, but it's not over yet. We need to make sure the investigation goes through and that the truth comes out." The arrival of the authorities brought a flurry of activity. Investigators combed through the yard, examining the ledger, the blueprints, and the hidden messages in the engine. Killian and Sarah gave their statements, recounting the harrowing experiences and the evidence they had uncovered. As the day wore on, news of the train yard's dark history began to spread. Reporters arrived, eager to capture the story of the haunted yard and the workers who had faced its ghosts. Killian and Sarah found themselves at the center of a media frenzy, but they remained focused on their goal. "We're not doing this for the headlines," Killian said during an interview. "We're doing this for the victims, for Thomas Gray, and for all those who lost their lives because of someone's greed and negligence." The authorities promised a thorough investigation and assured them that the truth would be brought to light. With the ledger and other evidence in hand, they were confident they could uncover the full extent of the sabotage and bring those responsible to justice. As evening approached, the workers gathered one last time in the maintenance shed. The atmosphere was somber, but there was a sense of closure in the air. They had faced their fears and uncovered the truth, and now it was time to say their final goodbyes to the haunted train yard. "We've been through a lot together," Killian said, his voice filled with emotion. "But we've also accomplished something important. We gave those spirits a voice, and we won't let their story be forgotten." The workers nodded, their faces reflecting a mix of sadness and pride. They had formed a bond through their shared ordeal, and they knew they would always carry the memories of the train yard with them. As they left the yard for the last time, the sky began to darken, and the first stars appeared. Killian and Sarah walked side by side, their steps slow and deliberate. They paused at the gate, looking back at the place that had changed their lives forever. "Do you think the spirits are at peace now?" Sarah asked, her voice a whisper. "I hope so," Killian replied. "But I think they'll rest easier, knowing the truth will come out." As they turned to leave, a soft breeze rustled through the yard, carrying with it a faint, ghostly whisper. It was as if the spirits were thanking them, bidding them farewell. Killian and Sarah exchanged a knowing glance, their hearts lighter as they walked away from the train yard. In the weeks that followed, the investigation revealed the full extent of the sabotage and the cover-up that had led to the tragic accident. The authorities arrested those responsible, and the story of the haunted train yard became a national headline. The victims were finally honored with a proper memorial, and the train yard was declared a historical site, preserved in memory of the lives lost and the truth uncovered. Killian and Sarah found themselves at the dedication ceremony, standing among the families of the victims and the townspeople who had come to pay their respects. As the names of the victims were read aloud, a sense of peace settled over the crowd. "We did it," Sarah whispered, tears in her eyes. "We gave them justice." Killian nodded, his heart full. "Yes, we did. And we'll never forget." As they stood together, the sun set over the train yard, casting a warm, golden glow over the memorial. The haunting whispers were gone, replaced by a sense of calm and closure. The spirits had been laid to rest, and the haunted train yard was finally at peace.